Good evening. Good evening and welcome very much to Conversations, where I'm very pleased to welcome to the program Philip Arnold. And Mr. Arnold is the consular and minister of the United States delegation to the United Nations and has been involved with the work of the Committee on Information at the United Nations. And Mr. Arnold, welcome very, very much to Conversations.
Thank you very much.
I was there yesterday. We're here in early May, and there was passed this resolution by the Committee on Information. And it was a consensus agreement among the members of the committee that I guess will be reported out to the General Assembly in the autumn.
That's right.
The fact that they were able to come to consensus, and you've been interested in these issues of information policy and so forth, that they were able to reach a consensus was very encouraging, I guess, to put it mildly.
Encouraging and notable.
Yes,
notable.
Right.
We've been working at this, or other colleagues here have been working towards this for the last 10 years, really.
Mm-hmm.
Because during the earlier part of the 80s, there was considerable ideological disputation amongst the participants about just what these instructions should include.
Yeah. I was going to ask that. What was the difference in the language? What was it that made us able to reach consensus? And what were the sticking points in the past on these issues?
Well, without suggesting that these consensus agreements only can be achieved by the lowest common denominator, although that's always true to a certain degree, the essential issue for the United States was that we could not ever vote with any group for a proposal which, in our view, allowed for any kind of control, registration, or limitation on the rights of journalists, the rights of a free press, and the rights of the free flow of information. And it was our feeling that the terminology in previous resolutions during the decade of the 80s allowed for that, even though the declaration may not have said specifically journalists should be licensed, for instance. The resolutions did indicate and include the idea that the press had some kind of responsibility to a higher authority.
Yeah, right.
It was never clear what that higher authority was, but presumably it was the state.
Right.
And this is something we just never could have any part of.
So you're really holding out, in a certain sense, for the free flow of information, as we understand it, perhaps.
Precisely.
Here, and the freedom of the journalist to be able to pursue whatever avenue they want to go.
Precisely.
That would be a principle. In principle, people probably, in the name of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or in idealistic principles, people would probably ascribe to that. But the reality, I suppose, is that here in the United States, there is a wide variety of programming possibilities. There is a commitment long-term to the freedom of the press and so forth. That probably is not characteristic of, there's a great number of countries and societies, cultures around the world where those kind of conditions don't apply to the degree that they do and with the intensity of feeling that they do here in the United States.
That's precisely correct. Programs such as yours, such as the conversation we're participating in now, are not normal in most countries of the world where television is controlled or owned by the state apparatus, where there's no sense of an obligation to the community to have all views, no matter how strange. Have access to public channels of information.
Or adversarial, perhaps.
Or adversarial, precisely.
And that has been a problem and a sticking point in terms of the argumentations that are going on in the United Nations, and it probably is a metaphor for larger argumentations about how societies are going to be organized.
Oh, I think that's quite true, and I think one of the reasons that we were able to join consensus this week is because there has been this flowering of people power or demand for individual rights, whatever you may term it, most dramatically in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union in the last year, but in other parts of the world as well. And I think that what you'd call statist societies in other parts of the world see that the flow of history is moving in this direction of increased individual freedom, increased right of the individual to express himself or herself. And you've seen this, of course, all over Latin America, where there's been, in the last decade, a complete movement to democratic societies. I guess Cuba is perhaps the only country in Latin America and South America that doesn't have a democratically established government. I'm probably wrong. There may be another one. But
well, yeah, and democracy is a big word. Patrick Watson just put together a documentary last year on the struggle for democracy and the definitions of it. It's a word that's used a great deal, and it's one that is very important that collectively the human society can understand what we mean by that, because there are many different interpretations of what we mean by democracy. But it is a big word. The ability for people, or the people, to be able to communicate is an overriding issue. Do we have a problem, we were talking before about our communications, particularly television. Television is increasingly relevant in terms of shaping consciousness. We have a large private sector development as far as television is concerned. As you indicated earlier, many of the countries of the world, television and communications is really very much of a state-run operation. It has been. Do you have a sense of that and what the proportion is or what the realities are on a world basis? And how do we address these differences that historically the countries have?
I don't think I've ever seen a figure or sort of a column of what belongs to the state and what belongs to private sectors. But I think most television and radio services in the world probably are state or government controlled, which is not to say that they're all censored. The British system is, after all, a governmental or system supported by a kind of a tax revenue, a subscription that's paid every month. And no one would suggest that the BBC is anything other than a very honest, balanced, excellent news organization, and entertainment organization.
It certainly does grace our public television here in the United States.
That's right, it does. So there's no automatic relationship between government or public ownership and control. It's more a function of the societies rather than the particular system. So I guess all in all, there are fewer private sector controlled television and radio programs, this is in the United States, than there are state ones. I'm sorry, the second point of your question was...
It was just really that point, because we really don't have... Well, we have public television, but that's even blends into the private sector a good deal of activity. So our situation, in a certain sense, is unique in the world, and the standards that we set to freedom of the press, as we think of it, we've always been committed to the idea of individual freedom to be able to express themselves, is one that we hold very dear. We've gotten over what drawbacks there were with the other nations of the world in reaching this consensus agreement on an international information order. They used the term new information
That was a phrase
How do we
used.
deal with that?
Well, in the late 70s, this idea emerged of the requirement for what was called a new world information and communication order. It predicated on the theory that the industrialized countries, not just the West, I presume the East as well. I mean, I guess the Soviets and TASS, and well, I meant the East in that sense, but also the East in terms of Japan, controlled the vast international telecommunications networks. They had the biggest newswire services. They had the biggest supply of television programs.
All true.
All true. And one heard from what was called the developing world, kind of the story of, you only report about floods and famines, and you never report about good economic development and good things that happen in our society. That perhaps is a reflection of how news is just played and dealt with.
Even in our own society.
Nobody.
Bad news is news.
Nobody writes anything. What good happens?
Yeah, I know.
No news story ever begins, "The sun rose this morning."
Yeah, right.
But out of this frustration came a feeling that there should be some kind of what was called a new balance, or an improved balance of the relationship. Some of it was technologically underdeveloped countries who wanted technical assistance and training assistance. That, I think, and we think, the United States thinks, is a splendid idea, and indeed we've been carrying it out for many, many years, as has the UN, through either governmental or private sector programs. There's long been an exchange of journalists and young radio journalists and young radio technicians and television engineers and such, both to private American organizations and through the U.S. government and exchange programs. And the French do the same thing, and the British and such, in order to bring the most technologically advanced training to make it available to professionals around the world. And similarly, there's been some transfer of technology as well, camera equipment and things of that sort. But as part of this concept of a new world order, there seemed to be included a concept of journalistic responsibility, which I mentioned before.
Yeah.
And this just can never be defined satisfactorily, because who are they responsible to? If they're responsible to anyone but themselves as independent journalists, if they have to be licensed, if they have to have passed a course of study, which means actually that they can be not allowed into that course of study, which means they can not allowed to be journalists.
They don't have bar exams for journalists.
That's right. I mean, what, a kid 16 or 17 can go work on a small town newspaper, get some experience, and work his way up, and if he's good, he's good.
The words can find an audience.
That's all, precisely.
Yeah. We're more given to that, more free-flowing. Right?
Yeah. Traditional societies.
Hyde Park corner writ large.
That's right. Traditional societies, I mean, even Europe, have more of a sense of training. Have you been trained as a journalist, actually? It's not in the American tradition. So it was these kinds of concepts of overcoming a previous inequity and of the responsibility of the media and of journalists to a higher body, a higher order, that we objected to profoundly, because these matters can be so easily, such regulations or statements can be so easily interpreted as a legitimization of some kind of control.
Yeah, right.
Registration.
And these are questions that we argue or discuss within our own body politics.
That's
within
right.
our own
right.
governmental and media critics or people within the media are asking ourselves these very questions as well. How there can be that, and perhaps it reflects the fact that the media is becoming, I'm not sure if this is true, but perhaps the media is becoming more important through time in terms of shaping public opinion and having, in a certain sense, a quasi-political and helping to set the social agenda, as it were. The media is becoming more important,
yes,
I presume, around the world.
I think that's quite true and very valid. But concurrently, it's also true that the 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 big media are less important than they were. That is to say, in the United States, for instance.
By virtue of cable.
By virtue of cable and public access, small magazines and desktop publishing. All those kinds of things produce a confusion of ideas in the media, almost.
Well, perhaps. Some people see it that way. I don't know. Ben Bagdickian, I suppose you'd be aware of, he's a critic, of course, of media, and he says that the ownership of the media systems within the United States and media, or the access to media, largely is a matter of, in a free market sense of private sector development, is a matter of the people who have the economic clout, as it were, which is another form of democracy, in order to get the investment in the technologies and so forth to make it possible for them to constitute what is, in fact, the media. So in a certain sense, there are many disadvantaged groups, even within our own society or perhaps on the world scale, who feel they don't have the economic advantage that makes it possible for them to have their voices adequately heard. Did you hear this in the discussions among
I must say that I did that kind of
sort of tied into
that kind of an issue didn't emerge in these particular conversations. Although I must interrupt your flow of conversation for a moment to recall an old friend of mine who I went to the University of Chicago with, who ended up owning, he inherited from his father and then developed a greater line of papers. He ended up owning 60 or 70 small town papers in the Midwest around Chicago. And I asked him one day if it gave him a kind of sense of power, kind of Lord Beaverbrook type. And he said, oh, no. He was interested in making a lot of money, and he left the editorial side and the news side to his professionals.
Well, all well and good to say that. It's all well and good. But Ben Bagdickian makes the point that it's increasingly being a concentration of the ownership of the media itself, both television, electronic, and he had said that the media was largely controlled by 50 companies. It's now down to about 28 in his reckoning. That through the agglomerate and through buying and through leverage buyouts and so forth, it's becoming the ownership, that is the private ownership of the private economy and the media, which we would have a large commitment to in this society, is owned by relatively fewer and fewer people, at least in Ben Bagdickian's
but
critique.
Do you find that reflected in news coverage or editorial attitudes?
Well, everyone would say no, and we're back again to the question of how independent could a journalist be, or how independent could anyone be if you're not answering to the critics would say, again, of the American or the Western media. The critics would say, if you're not answering to the government, you're answering to the advertising agencies and the people who set the agenda through economic control. Now, political control, but through the economic control. And the economic control is what some people, there was a discussion the other night with journalist Judy Woodworth and these people, and they said the advertising-based economics of the American industry is one that makes it difficult often for alternative thoughts to be able to find their way into the media mix, as it were, because it's not safe and it's not profitable. I mean, that's a critique of the American system. Or the Western system.
Well, these kinds of ideas, I would hope, will be more and more discussed in other parts of the world, perhaps as a reflection of the consensus we've agreed on at the United Nations about what information should be and how it should be handled. And
But you held fast in that we want to do what we can to allow the greatest free flow of information among the peoples of the world, and that's a principle that we can hold to. That people ought to have access to information, and it's an important, almost human right. You cite this in your statement that you read to the UN, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Right.
Article 19 maybe of that. But you cite that as a principle, and it's one that we would do well to repair to. The general idea, people should be open to and have available to them a widest possible variety of information that can be realistically made available to them.
I always refer back to Thomas Jefferson, who said whose first point was a free press. Before even anything in the government, he said what we have to have is a free press.
Yeah, a free press, right.
This is such a bedrock principle of American, of all of us who are Americans. I was about to say, not just the Constitution, but of all thinking Americans, a free press is the heart of our society and our system.
Yeah, a free press and the ability for the citizens to participate and have their opinions known. Yeah. That's an important principle. It's one of the things that you're dealing with in this the Committee on Information.
And this has not been a Republican or Democrat issue in our government.
And it's one that they're finally coming around to in a way, recognizing the importance of information on an international scale. This question we could of sovereignty of a country. A country has a sovereign right to set the agenda for itself. How are we to address the question of one country having programming that they think is appropriate to understanding the world and so forth, putting their programming into another country, and the exchange of information internationally between countries, as it were, maybe even a government or a quasi-governmental level, and how do we address that?
Well, some governments earlier on, as part of this Committee of Information exercise, raised this concept of sovereignty. It's one which we don't accept because it prevents the free flow of information. It means that you can jam radio stations, which, as you know, was done in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union over the last 40 years, on and off.
Like Radio Free
Europe, or the Voice of America, which was jammed for many, many years in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And Radio Free Europe was another one, and some of the German and Vatican stations were at one time or another jammed in Eastern Europe. The jamming ended. The world didn't end, and the new president of Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel, when he was here, made his remarkable statement about the critical importance that the Voice of America played. He was talking about the Voice at the time, in their Czech service, in keeping them informed and keeping their spirits up, and having the Czech people know that there was an outside world that knew what was going on and supported their quest for freedom.
Now, there's an interesting example. For instance, throughout the 40s and 50s, the Cold War, and then we had an ideological difference with the Soviet Union, let's say, and we had the Voice of America beaming programming into Eastern Europe, into the Soviet Union. They didn't have programming coming into the United States.
Yes, they did. And they still do.
Maybe you could share that with me, because in the days of McCarthy and the days of that anti-communist feeling that was so strong in the United States, there seemed not to be, and some people, critics, an effective alternate flow of information into the United States, presenting views that were different than the ones that you and I would accept perhaps as norms, but other people of the world would see as offering a voice of freedom to them against what they supposed we were suffering under.
I understand precisely. It goes both ways.
An issue.
We Americans have a great advantage because the world and world populations tend to admire our society politically, economically, and socially. and they tend to believe, sympathize, and believe what we say on our radio stations. I don't know when Soviet broadcasting began to the United States, but my instinct is that it was going on already in Joe McCarthy's time in the early 50s. I certainly know that in the last 25 years, and today, Radio Moscow broadcasts in English to North America.
They broadcast shortwave.
Shortwave, yeah. And not many people listen to shortwave in this country.
Right.
So their listening audience is more limited. On the other hand, you turn on television, if you move from your own channel to one of the other cable channels here, I see Arabic programs and I see French programs.
Well, there's
now that's a new development.
Yeah, and that perhaps reflects the fact there's so many different choices that the cable can make available.
Yep.
You've got so many different kinds of things. So, but there never was on the attitude of the United States an attitude of wanting to jam or block or not make available to the American citizenry programming, even if it was propagandistically oriented.
Precisely.
If there were other people who wanted to reach the American citizenry with some message that we may think is outlandish, but they think was important, we've never tried to jam, stop, or prevent them from reaching the American people. And that's a principle we stand on?
Precisely. I presume only FCC regulations about obscenity and other such matters.
Of thing. But we've never
not political contact.
There's never been political, what would be called in censorship.
That's right.
On the part of the United States of people.
Right. There's never been a jamming transmitter in the United States.
They haven't. There is beginning, as you say, in cable to be some of these alternate programs, but there hasn't been in the networks. Of course, I suppose that's just all a matter of the economics. It's a matter back again to the economics, which is important. And these issues are important to keep that kind of free flow of information going, and perhaps the cable offers an opportunity for some different kind of ideas.
It does. It does. Without meaning to make a commercial sponsorship or recommendation for anything, I'll mention the impact of CNN around the world.
CNN is everywhere.
Which has been quite extraordinary.
Amazing, yeah.
I know in our own diplomatic life, normally, and still today, we wait for a cable from Moscow or from Peking to report to us on the embassy's views about what's happened in economic or political development. But they're wildly out of date because all of us, I mean, my counterpart in Moscow has CNN turned on in the daytime. I come into my office and I have CNN turned on in the daytime.
And so all the ministers and the governments over there, everybody in the world.
All over the world. Going into Cuba, going to Vietnam.
At the invitation of the Cuban government.
That's right.
You want to comment on TV Marti, the idea of our putting programming into Cuba, and they're jamming it.
Yes.
And what the implications of that are, particularly since we're talking now about this information.
Well, we see, we believe that the broadcasting of television to Cuba is simply a normal extension of the broadcasting of radio into Cuba. We've had shortwave radio broadcasts all around the world since the Second World War.
Yeah.
And we've had Spanish language programs since that time. We've had special Spanish language programs to Cuba in a program called Radio Marti. Marti, named after a famous Cuban liberation hero, for the last 5 or 6 years. And a television program is a natural extension of that free flow of information. It's very easy for someone not to watch television Marti. All they have to do is turn off the television set. If they're offered something that's interesting, they will watch it. If it's non-competitive, which is to say if local television news and local radio news tells the whole story and the population and the viewership feels they're getting an honest view of the world, they won't bother listening to anything else. And that was certainly observed in the case of Eastern Europe, where radio broadcasts from Radio Free Europe or the Voice of America forced local radio broadcasters to be more honest and complete in their own programming. So we have been careful to follow the regulations of the ITU, which is the governing body in these matters, not to broadcast on a channel used by the Cubans.
That's working out.
Not to interfere precisely. Yeah, right. So not to interfere with their interfere with their frequency, and we will continue to do so. For the moment, this is of course a test. It was originally announced as a test of 2 or 3 months length to see how the technology worked and so on and so forth. After the test is over, I guess we'll be reviewing what's been accomplished and what can be accomplished in the future.
And there could be perhaps an extension of that. I mean, there could be television programming in other parts of the world to spread information around. That's part of the USIA?
Yes, that's part of the U.S. Information Agency.
And they
that's
have
correct.
and they have centers around the world, and they disseminate information around the world.
Yes, precisely.
It's an extension of that idea of extending
precisely
the influence of the USIA. Really,
Yeah.
in a sense.
We've had an U.S. government information effort really since the 30s under Nelson Rockefeller in Latin America. The USIA was created as an independent organization in 1953, and there are currently about 8,000 or 9,000 employees around the world, with offices in 130 countries and in some countries in multiple locations. In Germany, there are 10 or 12 different cities where there are offices. And these are cultural centers or information centers where there are libraries, collections of videotapes, cultural centers for music or lecture presentations of one sort or another. It's an organization that arranges the exchange of visitors between the two countries, both college students and professionals like yourself. We might invite a Czech or a Indian or a Korean journalist or television maker to the United States for a 30 or 40-day visit to see his counterparts, to learn about technological and scientific advances in his field. And we think that that kind of exposure to the United States can play a very important, can have a very important impact and play a very important role in future political life. One of the most famous exchangees was Margaret Thatcher in 1967, when she was brought to the United States under what we call the International Visitor Program. The present president of South Africa, Mr. de Klerk, was a visitor 15 or 20 years ago. There are many others, the president of Egypt and many others have come to the United States, seen our society. One of the leading members of the Soviet government, Mr. Alexander Yakovlev, who is considered Mr. Gorbachev's key advisor in international affairs, was an exchange student here at Columbia for a year in 1959.
So that gave him a chance to get some of the culture, some of the
That's
feelings,
right.
some of the
That's
values, and that's an extension of that. Now, other countries have that as well. I mean, other countries have information services, and this is part of the normal operation.
International diplomatic intercourse.
And if that idea of the TV Marti, if Cuba were to beam television programming into this country, saying, down with the U.S. imperialists or something, if they were to see it, or to, do you understand, we don't recognize Cuba as a special problem, of course. But
if they met the same obligations and responsibilities of the International Telecommunications Union that we are doing...
Those obligations, if I may, those obligations relate primarily to the need of technologically making sure that there's no cacophony of bandwidth or of frequency clashing. It's not political at all. If they met those...
They could broadcast into the United States.
They could broadcast, and there would be no political...
They could broadcast into...
Would there be anyone that there would be an objection to? One wonders where one draws the line between information and, let's say, in special situations, what we call propaganda. I presume, let's just for an absurdity, Adolf Hitler would not have been able to set up a radio or television service in the United States in the midst of the Second War. Do you understand? There is a line drawn there where the political division is such that it can't be tolerated. But during these times, you think it would be fair to say that the thinking within, let's say, the State Department and so forth would be that people are free to let that two-way flow of information come to affect American citizens to the degree they can do it without creating technological cacophony or something like that? How
could our position be anything else? Because we think it's quite clear what we're doing is quite legal. Therefore, if the Cubans wanted to do it, it would be legal for them as well. The Canadian, well, let me put it a different way. Mexican television is seen all over the Southwest.
Is that because it bleeds up from their transmission, right?
They may do it on purpose. They may not do it on purpose.
This is a really tricky thing because those radio waves and television waves don't respect those lines on the ground, do they?
U.S. television bleeds into Canada all the time.
Yeah, to the mutual benefit of the two cultures, perhaps, that sort of thing.
I think in both
cases.
So
that in general, this idea of there being an exchange of information might be something that could be not only encouraged by American State Department and ourselves, but by a good deal of the world. And do you think that there's increased recognition of that by the members that make up the Committee of Information that made it possible to where this reciprocity, recognition of this reciprocity is something that got over some of their objections. And of course, then there's always the question of the fact that we're so much more powerful economically than some of the other countries. They haven't got the wherewithal to do that.
Yep.
But we do. Those two
Yep.
questions. But could you address it briefly, maybe?
I would be happy to think, but I don't think it really is the case, that that all of our colleagues on the Committee of Information and in many parts of the world see the positive value of this kind of intercultural communication. It was a step in the right direction this week at the Committee of Information. I think what you've talked about is still somewhat in the future when countries see the increased value of it. I'm sorry, your second point was...
No, the point was just, the second point was that to have a free flow of information among the peoples of the world, so that as we in the Voice of America and so forth communicate to other countries, and in a certain sense give them a sense of our values that we hold dear and so forth, then other countries who may have different values, and that's the essence of the UN, would be free to broadcast
do the same
into our country
precisely
without political intervention and our saying, we disagree with
That's
what
right.
you say.
Yeah.
We don't put a stricture on the satellites or the distribution systems in the United States and say no one else can broadcast here. These mines belong to us.
That's
we
right.
Want to, in fact, we want to avoid that.
Precisely.
Well,
Precisely.
then that really does give a chance
Precisely.
for the philosophy of the United Nations and a coming together of different views to maybe find expression in the broader media mix of the world. Which
They will.
might be a place where a lot of tension, a lot of frustration, and a lot of ideas could be investigated, if that's the right term, in a media simulation, as it were. It has.
Yeah.
So this work of the committee is really very important as
I think it has
telecommunications becomes more important.
considerable implications around the world, considerable implications. We had a first small step this week, but I think we could be able to build on that in coming years, because communications is so much at the heart of international discourse, international diplomacy. We have the ability to sit here and televise programs which will end up being seen in Bonn or in Tokyo, conversations with the Japanese ambassador and the American ambassador, or yourself and foreign news colleagues, bouncing it off a satellite and down to an audience far away in the world.
Yeah, Arthur Clarke was really pressing when he saw, or Marshall McLuhan, who said that we were going to be moving into a global village with these communications capabilities. And, it just seems to be a mark of the time and the promise of these technologies. And I don't know, as an outsider, as an independent, smaller scale producer of television programming, I was duly impressed by the fact that the committee had been able to reach a chord. It felt good that these people could find a consensus among them, and that it's a step forward in this very interesting and important area of trying to work out the way in which we're going to be able to communicate with one another. And it seemed to me to be of great interest. I thought your words, if I may say so, were very well taken at the meeting yesterday, and I'm glad that we've gotten over the difficulties that had made that so difficult in the past. It reflects a consensus view that begins to emerge among the peoples. Does it give you room for optimism?
Oh yes, by all means, by all means. There's a kind of, we would say, pragmatism, a pragmatic approach. It's a word Americans like particularly in the group. But there's a mood and a sense, I think, in the United Nations that with the end of great ideological conflict, and that really has ended in great part, the UN can play a much more important and central role in positive developments, certainly in information and cultural and social matters, just as it does in peacekeeping, and perhaps ultimately in economic and environmental matters as well. The UN is becoming a very important and central point for the foreign policies of many countries. And I think what you saw yesterday was one of the reflections of that.
Well, okay, fine. It's really interesting, and I'm glad to have made note of it, and I want to thank you for all your work in terms of representing U.S. interests there and maintaining that, and for your thoughts here in terms of the information orders begin to move ahead. There are a million questions that are raised, and maybe we could check back with you a little bit down the line, and maybe as this comes up to the General Assembly, it's going to be presented. I guess in the fall it'll be presented.
Precisely. And
then they're trying to work out these issues. A lot of the issues, it's a metaphor for many of the issues that divide the peoples of the world, and it gives us a place where a lot of these issues can be, in a certain sense, thrashed out and understood. And so in a certain sense, it's a United Nations of the air, in a certain sense.
Quite right.
It is.
Quite right.
Okay, well, listen, I want to thank you very, very much.
Pleasure.
Pleasure of the perceptions in it. Philip Arnold, he again is consular and minister of the United States delegation to the United Nations and has been long working on communications issues and working directly with the Committee on Information here at the United Nations. Happy to have been able to bring you his perceptions. We here invite you to stay tuned. There'll be more coming up in the same general topic area momentarily. That's it for this particular segment. Mr. Arnold, once again, thank you very, very much indeed. Please stay tuned. We're coming right back. Welcome back now to Conversations, where I'm very pleased to welcome to the program on this section Dr. William Preston. And Dr. Preston is a senior editor, a senior writer for a book, an extremely interesting one that I'd like to show here right at the outset. The book is called Hope and Folly, and it's subtitled The United States and UNESCO, 1945 to 1985, and it is, of course, a study of the United States and UNESCO and the United States relationship to the international community, the United Nations. And William Preston, it was co-authored, I guess, along with Herbert Schiller and Edward Herman. And Dr. Preston, Bill, if I may, welcome very, very much to Conversation.
Thank you very much.
We've been talking earlier to the interview, to this particular, introductory to this one, about the Committee on Information and the relationship of the United States to the broad world community through the United Nations. This is something you've been interested in. Do we stand in a unique position as far as our understanding of communication, as far as much of the rest of the world does? Or how do we stack up in terms of the United States, its official representation, its media representation, maybe even some of its critical media representation, as far as understanding international telecommunications, and particularly television?
That's a large question.
Yes, indeed.
And I think it has to begin with the United States' own tradition, which is the First Amendment tradition of free speech and free press.
Very strongly held, and rightly so.
But there is also a tradition that the United States has, which it has forgotten, that it was once itself a third world country, and faced many of the same issues that third world countries of today face. That is, of underdevelopment, of the need to protect itself from the onslaught of foreign cultures, particularly the British.
Foreign and perhaps more powerfully, politically and economically. Right?
Yes, in fact, at the end of World War II, the American media, and most particularly the Associated Press, considered it an outrage that the European cartel of wire services, the English, the French, and the Germans, had long dominated the distribution of world news. And the U.S. view was that because those were national wire services, they in fact represented a political, cultural, and nationalistic bias in terms of the nature of the news they delivered. And the United States resented being in a receiving position as a minority rather than one of the majority deliverers of news. And as the post-war world developed, the United States, in a sense, espoused the doctrine of the free market and free flow, which was really another way of saying that they wanted to have a dominant position in the information age that was appearing.
It was this. That's a convenient attitude to have, particularly if you can see yourself emerging as the dominant force. It's interesting to take a position, well, we'll just let everything go in a free form because they were the dominant force.
Right.
It reflected, in a sense, perhaps, the fact that they were the dominant force and able to comfortably be able to assume that position.
Right, and what they had lived through in their own history and what they had decried as powerful and self-interested manipulators of world opinion, they now, in a sense, took on as their own rightful inheritance, and began to, as Margaret Blanchard says in her book, export the First Amendment. She titles her book Exporting the First Amendment, which is an analysis of the early post-war years in which the United States saw the UN and UNESCO as being ideal agencies to remove, reduce, eliminate all barriers to the movement of information, which to the American media meant a world devoid of resistance to the dominant, and you might say imperial power of the U.S. media.
That's an interesting way to see it. Americans might argue that they want to be sure that there's no censorship, that there's no licensing, that there's no nothing to inhibit the free flow of information. And on the surface of it, that's a laudable idea.
It's a little bit
difficult to see that when you have a world that is not on an equal playing field in terms of economic power and clout. It's rather like saying NBC or ABC saying, well, you have the complete right to do anything that you want with the media when they are so dominant. Of course, there were some other things that have come along in the history, but it reflected the economic and the informational dominance of that the United States enjoyed.
Not only enjoyed, but saw itself as increasing. For example, at the end of the war, it was all very well to say, let's have free flow in the free marketplace of ideas. No one can disagree with that. On the other hand, the U.S. controls 60% of the world's newsprint.
All right.
And to much of Europe and even other parts of the world, the resources, the access to resources, if you could print a 4-page paper, and the United States could print dozens of 40-page papers, there's an inequity there in the ability to convey your own views of national and world events.
Your book, this book, Hope and Folly, focuses on the United States and UNESCO.
Indeed.
It's important to try to understand our relationship to that institution from which we have withdrawn now since 1985.
Well, I think it's important to understand the United States' relationship to international organizations and the way that the United States has used them, and I would also say abused them. I don't think there's a really strong feeling for internationalism in the United States, but when the UN and UNESCO were created, very quickly the United States saw both those organizations as excellent agencies for the removal of barriers to the flow of information.
Mostly information from here to there.
Right. That's right, that the rest of the world, in a sense, would be passive recipients to American movies, American, well, later television, but radio broadcasting and American magazines, books, and newspapers.
And that certainly has been the case.
Yeah, we often tied in the treaties we signed that the nation should have a free press and a free market for American periodicals and newspapers. The Marshall Plan aided that in terms of that funds, blocked currencies could be used to pay for media. So there was a great expansion of the U.S. presence, not only in Europe, but in the rest of the world following World War II. Now, in terms of the relationship to UNESCO, the United States insisted that education, science, and culture should not be the totality of UNESCO's interest, that it should also include a fourth component, communications. And initially, as the Cold War developed and the hostility between the United States and the Soviet Union came to dominate all international events, the United States saw UNESCO as a way of fighting the Cold War. That the UNESCO would reduce the barriers so that the United States and the United States media could counter, quote, communist propaganda around the world. Kind of a Marshall Plan of ideas under American enterprise.
Well, they had the Voice of America, they had other kinds of USIA, very, very active, very influential in terms of exerting their influence in other parts of the world. They've even taken to funding, Lenny Brenner told us on a recent program, even helping to fund election campaigns in countries like El Salvador, where there was actually funds given to Mrs. Chamorro in order to support her election campaigning, which is in a sense information and propagandizing, if that's the right word. But
that's true. I mean, a lot. The U.S. was a member of UNESCO for 40 years and espoused the free press, free marketplace of ideas throughout that and resisted any attack upon it. On the other hand, it's hard for me to see this as an honest rather than hypocritical expression, because we have interfered in the free marketplace of ideas. Mm-hmm. We've interfered in it at home in the suppression of alternative views, in our paranoia about alien ideas, in the loyalty security tests we insisted on for international civil servants, and in the covert media propaganda activities of the CIA and then the government through Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe. So that it's not as though the U.S. left the marketplace alone and said it's open to all. It enters covertly through secret financing of media assets, publications, and books. As CIA had a bigger budget, let's say, than UNESCO did, which was supposed to be the avenue in which all voices had a hearing.
Yeah, television and communication is increasingly important in terms of shaping consciousness. It's increasingly important. Those who were saying in the international community who had spoke to economic inequalities that existed in the world, there had been discussions in the international community of a new economic order. Many people who were in positions of favored status as far as the world took umbrage or took exception to that idea that we needed anything other than a status quo understanding of economic realities. There was a term, new information order,
right,
which was linked to that in a certain sense, and in a sense was trying to voice the sense that people had that we needed to have a more equitable distribution of cultural and information exchange between the peoples of the world. The United States has taken exception to that as well historically, and does that have anything to do with our pulling out of UNESCO?
Indeed. I would look at it this way. In the 40s and the 50s, the United States free flow arguments tended to be cast in a Cold War framework. In other words, they wanted the international organizations to basically spread the American view of the world, to counter the communist view. Now, an international organization, which by the 1960s came to represent 161 nations, is not supposed to represent the view of one nation. I mean, we would certainly be upset if UNESCO or the UN simply represented the Soviet view of the world. Certainly would have been then. Now, in the 1960s, as there was a certain détente in the U.S.-Soviet rivalry, and there were dozens of new nations. In other words, the U.S. had ignored the whole national liberation explosion, but into UNESCO they came, and by the late 60s, they were crying out for development. And they were crying out for a development that changed the nature of the status quo. And that's where you hear the talk of a new economic order. More distributive justice, more equality of opportunity, more access to raw materials, more regulation, if you will, on behalf of those who had not yet become economically developed. And it was apparent to the non-aligned movement in the early 70s that they could not make their case for a new economic order unless they had the communications to carry their side of the argument to a world audience.
Yeah, it becomes increasingly important, even in immediate terms, as we enter an informational environment. There's a great deal of talk in the United States about our moving into superconductors and to the computers and communication and information order, and understanding a new information economy is important. So the overwhelming dominance of the American, of the United States and the Western European, but particularly the United States in terms of television and other kinds of programming, is something that really ought to be addressed even in economic terms. And it's not enough for the biggest guy on the block just to say everyone should be free to compete, because it's very, very difficult when they have such tremendous resource. And it's interesting that we receive very little cultural influence from other parts of the world. It really is a one-way flow of information that largely characterizes television and the shaping of the attempts to influence consciousness by technology. Huh?
I would definitely agree, and I think that's why the U.S., when it was a third world nation itself, and right up through World War II, had a very, I would say, strong view of its own cultural identity, and it did not want that cultural identity to be subverted by un-American or foreign ideas.
Right. We should be able to understand that. Right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Now, when other nations claim that their cultural, see, many of them have been colonial or neo-colonial in a neo-colonial condition.
Absolutely.
Now they have liberated themselves, like the blacks after the Civil War, and they too want their 40 acres and a mule.
Yeah.
And some independence. And in a sense, they are forced back, as the blacks were in the cities of the North, into an information ghetto, where they are not controlling the ideas and the values that they believe are essential to their own national development.
So again, it's back to the question of the United States stressing freedom as a principle that anyone is free to stand on the street and say whatever he wants, but the economic realities in our own nation, 40% of all assets are owned by the upper 1%, 5% virtually own them all. We're very much of an economic plutocracy. It's very, very narrowly held. Ben Bagdikian has written eloquently on the concentration of ownership of the means of production within our own society. So it's not really enough to say that everyone should be able to compete when the deck is so stacked in favor of those who already have the means for doing that and the economic clout to pursue their own agenda. That's a major thing.
We are in agreement. And it's not only the third world. When the satellite technology took off, it was Canada and Sweden who emphasized the issue of cultural independence and not becoming recolonized because of superior information resources. And I frankly think it's legitimate for a nation to protect its sovereignty against, you might say, the information equivalent of intercontinental ballistic missiles. If they wish to prevent satellite intrusion into their airspace, it seems to me they either have to jam it, or they have to have an international body that will say they have a right to protect their own values.
Yeah, well, okay, it could be. Or we have this TV Marti thing. We're actually trying to broadcast into Cuba directly into the home broadcast, and so forth. Or there might be also the idea. One other idea is if we're going to have this Voice of America and that sort of thing reaching out into the world in such tremendous force, there ought to be an opening upon countervailing views to be able to reach into the people of the United States. That might be another. We have a very one-dimensional pattern to the programming. The McNeil-Lehrer report even has been criticized by the FAIR people recently as being very one-dimensional. There should be some outside influence that should be able to reach into the American people to get some alternative views, or that should be encouraged. That's a sideline. We're running short on time. We're just trying to get the idea, because that idea of free flow of information.
It's more than dissemination. It's access and it's discovery of different voices, and cultural exchange has to be reciprocal.
Yeah. And the means by which that cultural exchange can be realized through technology, and because it requires technology for these things to happen, so that the guarding of the sovereignty of a nation is one principle, but also the idea of cross-cultural pollination, as it were, is something that perhaps should have a role there to be played. But we should be getting some more of that into our ethnocentric...
And we should go back into UNESCO where these issues are being discussed instead of picking up our marbles and leaving.
That's essentially what we did. We just picked up our marbles and left because we were out of touch with
And by the way, we threatened sanctions to cut off our financial support if UNESCO did anything that we would find abusive of free press, free market, and so on. They never did. We never cut off a cent.
Huh, really?
We still pulled out.
Well, this is an issue. We've been talking about the work of the Committee of Information and the work of the UN and some of the understandings between the people of the United Nations of a new or information order, how we're going to arrange the relationship of technological extension to one another. And this book Hope and Folly, which is published by who again?
University of Minnesota.
University of Minnesota Press. Has been put out by senior author William Preston. Dr. Preston has been our guest here. William Preston is also involved with the Institute for Media Analysis, which we might let people know here. Bill Schaap and Ellen Ray and so forth, Mr. Herman, Noam Chomsky, and some others. They got a new critique of the
monthly
media.
Critique, Lies of Our Times.
Lies of Our Times, which we would just let the people in the audience know about. And so those are two things that we're happy to be able to let them to know about. And once again, it's a big subject, Bill. I really want to thank you for coming in, discussing it with us.
I'll be glad to come back for 24 hours.
24 hours, we could talk about it, maybe really get to the core of some of these issues and so forth. It's been your pleasure to have the Perceptions in on this segment of Dr. William Preston again, major author of Hope and Folly. Thank you very, very much for viewing. We invite you on Conversations to tune in again next week. We'll be coming back again next week. I'm afraid that's it for this particular segment. Bill Preston, once again, thank you very, very much for coming.
Thank you, Harold. Enjoyed it.
Good night. We will see you next week.
Every man, every woman, every child, regardless of race or creed, has the right to a life of dignity with the assurance of certain inalienable rights. These rights are contained in the 30 Articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. December 10th is the anniversary of this document, adopted in 1948 at the United Nations. It is considered by most to be an international treasure, and, as such, should be carefully and tenaciously guarded. Guarded against those who would seek to destroy these rights to serve their own ends. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in essence, means survival. It should be honored and cherished, and above all, never be taken for granted. December 10th, Human Rights Day.
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations 40 years ago, may not be a legally binding document. It is rather a promise made by all the members of the United Nations to the people of the world. We at Amnesty International believe that the governments who have adopted the Declaration have a moral responsibility to keep that promise.
Write Amnesty International, Post Office Box 37137, Washington, D.C. 20013.
This may be the best kept secret in the world, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 40 years ago, the United Nations wrote and adopted it. Every single member country promised to support it, every single one. They also promised to teach, publicize, and display it. Have you ever heard of it? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
To get your copy, write Amnesty International, P.O. Box 37137, Washington, D.C. 20013.